So firstly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mary Copeland, who is the Associate Professor in the School of Mathematics and Physical Sciences at UTS, and is an honour. Oh, there's more. Don't wait. There's always more with all of us. And is an honorary life member of the Mathematical Association of New South Wales in Australia. And she's won many, many awards, including a personal citation for excellence in teaching mathematics at UTS. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you, George.
Next to Mary is Shannon Brown, who is a touring music director and conductor, as well as a consummate performer, composer, and he's an educator here at JMC in the music department. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you.
And we're just jumping over this side. We have Michaela Epstein, who founded Maths Teaching Circles, which provides local and global resources on her main philosophy, which is that maths can be fun. And she believes curiosity drives competence and builds confidence. Yeah,
Thank you.
So at the far end of the queue down here, we have Dr. Melissa Silk, and she's the head of design here at JMC, but she's got a side hustle creating experiences for all people to connect maths with making. She's got a business called Steam Pop, and this usually involves paper and things that light up, right? And we're not talking cigarettes, all right? Or rollies, as it should be. No, we're not. So, and next to me, and I know a lot of you people know who he is. Oh, big round of applause for Melissa. Is Eddie Wu, and if you don't know him already, is a maths educator, superstar, and founder of WooTube. Check it out, 1.8 million subscribers. He's a local hero, a hero dad, and a high school teacher. Did you like that? I put the hero in next to the dad. Did you like that? Little play on words. Yeah, that's a bit of creative twist on the theme here. So, why are we here? So we're going to break this conversation down into two parts just to get us into it. So firstly, we understand that maths is a creative process. Maybe we don't understand that, actually. That's part of it. But maths is a creative process. And trying to get a bit of a handle around that in the creative state. So let's just start with Shannon, because this is called the circle of fifths. Where's it gone? Where's my circle? You'll notice I'm like 5.5. I'm the little blip on it there, so it didn't quite work with the numbers. That's okay. Shannon, can you explain the circle of fifths from a music perspective, just to get us in that maths and creativity going?
Alrighty, I'm first. Okay. Well, circle of fifths, let's say it's the roadmap to opening up all our 12 wonderful keys. But if we're talking mathematics, let's say it's the formula for deciphering the mechanics and structure of music. How do we sum all this up in a minute? Let's go back to the early 6th century BC. We've got this wonderful philosopher, Pythagoras, who was experimenting with acoustics, with frequencies and ratios, and he came up with the Pythagorean syntonic temperament of tuning and the mean tone tuning. But ideally, what does that mean? Well, let's say we have a string here. We play the string, it'll vibrate, it'll produce a frequency, and it'll produce a sound. Then he thought, okay, let's halve that string. That'll be a higher frequency and a higher sound. So he was dealing with ratios, and the perfect ratio he came up with was 3:2, and that led itself to the pure perfect interval of the fifth. And of course, they're all related, but in our circle of fifths, you can see how the fifth is integral in sort of syncing all of the keys in our chromatic Western scale. And if you're talking about a scale, you were briefly discussing in the green room how you finally got the circle of fifths. Well, it's basically our major and minor scales. There's 8 notes, and the fifth is the fifth interval from the tonic. But I suppose, and I also added in these wonderful 7 magic triads of a major scale. So when we're dealing with intervals, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 6th and 7th, these are all intervals that are adding on to some chords, And ladies and gentlemen, that right there is the formula for creating one of the hit songs that we're all listening to now. It's just we've got to rearrange some of the chords there, but you could say that, you know, the basic mathematical system was based off frequencies and mathematical equations, really. How about that?
How about that? Fantastic. It's interesting, but a lot of musicians are really good at maths, so we can talk about that a little bit later, that very strong correlation between maths and music. I'm just going to go over to Eddie, because you shared a G.H. Hardy quote. Is that all right? I'm just going to read that out, and you can respond to it. I am interested in mathematics only as a creative art. But this sentence hardly makes sense to modern ears, because most people today would identify mathematics as the opposite of creative. So, in what way can a subject like maths, so often characterised by these really rigid formulas and algorithms and all those things that frighten people, really, be thought of as an outlet for creativity?
George, for me, I think it's not just people out there can be surprised to hear something like that sentiment. I remember I was very surprised. It was probably in my second or third year teaching, I finally looked at the first 30 pages of the maths syllabus that I was entrusted with to teach. I always just kind of flipped past those 30 pages to get to the content. And one day, something possessed me to actually look at perhaps the first 30 most important pages. And there, the first line of the rationale for the New South Wales mathematics syllabus, it said, mathematics is a reasoning and creative activity. And I was shocked as a maths teacher. I was like, what is this doing here? It's been here this whole time. But I feel like the best way to explain this is just by showing it to you. Now, can I just get a quick show of hands? George, you mentioned you're on the creative side. Who would self-identify here as on the mathematical side in the room? Can I get a show of hands? There's a lot of hands. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, hands down. Which means that I wager some of you have already worked out what that question mark is, okay? Now, to your point, George, about like, mathematics doesn't seem creative because there is one and only one answer, unambiguously, black and white, to what that question mark is. So that seems like it's not a very creative thing, that we're all kind of fenced into getting the same answer. But if I told you, actually, that's not really the point. It's 6. I don't care that it's 6. I want to know why. Or how. How did you even get to there? If I told you there was a way to find out that number, for example, without using a single fraction or decimal, some of you would say, can't do that. 37, 43, those are prime. I'm not supposed to be able to do that. But what if I told you there was another way to be creative? Maybe you'd need a pair of scissors to, well, don't take apart JMC's screen, but print it out, rearrange it. I can think of at least 3 different ways, and not because I can think of them, because my students have shown them to me, 3 different creative ways to get at that same answer. And for me, I think this is part of what Hardy was talking about. The mathematics often is about answers and getting to them and being right and accurate. But just as much, I think we all, those of us who raised our hands before, have this sense of the aesthetic, the beauty of a beautiful, elegant solution. And that takes a lot of creativity, I think.
Beautiful, thank you, thank you. So anyone else want to quickly add anything to that before I just move on about that? Dumbfounded, it's got them. That's okay. So I just want to jump into, so we've understand that there's these elements here. So the outlet, so creativity, we want to expose the connections between creativity and maths. Let's just see where this actually works. And you've given us some examples of how these 2 elements work. So I want to know, I mean, we're saying creativity, maths, but really, why is it important? How do we do it? And that great question, as probably every student says, why does it matter, right? Why does it matter, right? But let's really pull that whole thing apart. Because I think if we understand why something matters, I think we're all educators or your students or a lot of us here, if you can get to a student and get so that they understand why something matters, it's just like a gateway to understanding and trying to dive into something. So let's do that. And I'm going to just jump over to Melissa. Let's just dive into this mathematical and this creative process smashing together, where it happens. So let's talk about that from your design perspective or any perspective you want to add.
Thanks, George.
Yeah.
I'm on the creative side of things, I suppose, but also I've just got a healthy interest in mathematics. And that doesn't mean that I can solve equations. I struggled with to get to number 6, but maybe I'd get there in the end. But what I did a few years ago with a very good colleague who was the head of maths at International Grammar School, who Mary knows, Jane Martin, has developed a course which was all about the blending of those things, the blending of mathematics and other areas, or actually not so much the blending, but it was to find the fundamental maths that underpins something creative, and it was sat outside of curriculum, and we were given permission to do this by I guess a progressive principal at the time. But then it led me to sort of understand how I was applying mathematics in all of the design teaching that I was doing, and I still do, and then all of life, and then all of the other stuff that was going on as well. And as you know, I mean, I'm going to go off-piste here a little bit, but 3 of us on here are sailors. You know, we use maths all the time with sailing. We've got the skipper in the audience, he'll be shouting at us, use the numbers and blah, blah, blah. But up here is just an example of one of our projects, and I just wanted to bring this in because I want to bring you to the big round donut type image, which I actually have here. It's an intaglio print. It's a print, and so it's a fine art process. An intaglio print means that the ink goes in and then you press something on it and it comes out. But that started as basically a parabolic curve. So it was an exploration of Cartesian plotting and graphing right at the beginning. The maths had to be studied before you could actually think about how do we apply this creatively. Each of the images, it's a bit hard to see the dark blue one, but that doesn't matter. Each of the images were then another exploration of curves, but taking it a little bit further, where people then used their own surnames to create a curve from their initials that were plotted instead of the numbers, but using the alphabet as the points of reference, and then just taking it into some vector graphic software, and then playing around with the elements and principles of design, which are also mathematical, rotation, scale, etc. But I love that one. That's my favourite. This one is my favourite because this fellow student was so-called had a learning disability. And he produced this a beautiful piece of work. And I asked him if I could have one of them because they printed a few. Because to me, it just represents so much about the possibilities. It's so elegant and simple, and has a really basic foundation in a mathematics, a mathematical curve that just is. So it's the existential kind of process that we were getting at, and he got it, and I just thought it was beautiful. So that's it.
So what you're doing, you're talking about applying. There's like an applied outcome here. So you've taken this mathematical sort of theory and processes, and actually then transferring that into the creative process.
The whole thing had to be underpinned. Every project that we did had to be underpinned by some pure maths, and it had to have an output that was physically or digitally aesthetic.
Good.
Can I
Yes,
just jump in
please
quickly?
jump in, yes.
We as a panel, we've had some conversations before, but I had no idea what Melissa was about to say there. And I don't know if anyone else in the crowd is thinking this, but I look at that image that you were just talking about, and I can't help but get vibes of, here we are in Sydney, the most iconic building in Australia, the Sydney Opera House, and the beautiful spherical solution that Johan Utzon came up with. It's very reminiscent of that simple geometry, but
It's really cool because we're talking about a spherical solution, but that's a 2D, representation. So there's so many different ways you can go. And we also do a project with the Opera House, and we've looked at some of your work with them to influence that as well. Yeah, it's sort of like creation of 3 dimensions out of 2-dimensionality, which we explored a lot of in the course was called Thinking Hyperbolically.
All right. And you had to explain what that meant in the first place, which is great. So even hyperbolic.
Yeah, it was really wanky because we put a exclamation mark at the end of it. That's how it was trademarked. Well, it wasn't, but...
I love it. For those in the know, it's great. But let's jump into the teaching here, because it's not black and white. It's actually what you're saying is that maths and creativity, it's actually full of colour, right? It's colours and shapes and 2D, 3D, and all these connecting things, and it has an aesthetic. So, Michaela, let's just jump over to you, and referring to the triangle-like shapes that we've got up there. How might we ignite creativity with the teachers who teach maths in schools? I mean, at the coalface, like primary and secondary, or any level that you choose to talk about, because I think it's relevant. I'll talk with Mary about higher education in a moment, but let's maybe have a look at that.
Sure. There's some really interesting examples that I think help teachers and help everyone to start to see maths in slightly different ways and what that experience of being a young child learning maths for the first time can be like. And this is some fantastic research that really brings it to life. So this is some research that looked at children's understanding of a triangle. It's one of the most basic shapes, and you know, from a very, very young age, we all know what a triangle is, right? Yet, here's the thing, this research found that there were certain instances or exemplars of a triangle that were very familiar and understood by children, and other instances, even when they were triangles, were not recognised as such. Or when they were sort of like a triangle, like number 5 up there, but not mathematically so. Sometimes they would still get labelled as that. So this research is a lovely example of how I think maths isn't black and white. It's full of these shades of grey and colour that show us that concepts, even the really familiar ones, have these subtleties that are worth us uncovering with learners. And so what that means is just going through step-by-step processes to learn what a triangle is, or how to calculate the area of something, or how to do a multiplication problem. Just going through what might seem like an obvious set of steps is going to be obvious in one instance, or maybe to one learner, but it's not going to make sense all of the time. So for me, this is the really compelling reason of why we need creativity, to be able to uncover those shades in grey and go back and forth between concepts.
Oh, Mary, I'm just going to jump over to you anyway. So, yeah, jump in, and
Can
I'm
I
going
jump in
to
on
jump
that?
in. Then I'm going to throw you a question as well.
Okay. Thank you. And it's great that we're starting to talk about the teaching of mathematics now, because sometimes in the process of teaching, we come against the anti-creativity, which is there's a rule, there's a definition. And that's sometimes the tension in teaching mathematics that makes teachers wince a little bit when they have conversations with mathematicians. And I know we have some brilliant mathematicians in the audience here, and I can see Nalini smiling at that comment. But I'm not including you in that, Nalini. But I was at a really interesting session today at ICME. Now, look, we're all maths teachers or mathematician type folk. Well, most of us are from the hands. Could you draw in the air, please, the shape of a cubic equation that has 3 real roots? Ready? Everybody ready to do it with me? Up and down and up again. Lovely, lovely.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. I actually did know how to do that, I'm sure.
Now, in the session today, Alan Pinto was describing how a bunch of teachers were teaching this, and were very excited when the students described that as 2 parabolas mushed together. Well, it does look like 2 parabolas mushed together, doesn't it? But they were in a conversation with mathematicians who said, no, you don't combine 2 parabolas to get a cubic. And mathematically, by their rules, that's correct. But if you're teaching, we want the creative sense of making up words and putting concepts and ideas together, and maybe we'll get to the definitions later.
It's interesting, because I was actually going to ask you about, because you're in the higher education and you're working with people who've, for those who choose to do maths in the higher education, sort of statisticians, mathematics and that. Firstly, I'd just like to understand what pure maths is, because I hear that. And I'm wondering if we ever applied that to creativity, would be sort of an interesting pure creativity. And I do hear pure maths, you know, someone said that. Because I feel like there is no pure creativity. If someone told me they had that, I'd go, well, I'm not interested. It sounds boring. Because it sounds perfect. There's something perfect about it. So in creativity, there's this great sense of unknowing. You never know. In fact, if you know the outcome, I'd say you're not in the creative space, you're in the industrial space. You're just replicating something you're already aware of its outcome, which is different to the creative space, I think, where there's a sense of unknownness. So I'm just going to throw that into the mix. So talk to me about this notion of how do you teach this, and how might you bring creativity in when we're talking high-level people just doing maths? Yeah.
Well, I think we would need to bring some pure mathematicians to the table for that, and maybe there'll be time later to do that. My passion is applied mathematics, and I see we've got some nice illustrations here. So if you don't mind, George, I'm going to jump into the applied
jump around,
mathematics.
I don't mind.
Because some years ago, with colleagues at UTS, and is Anne in the audience? Thanks, Pauline. I thought she might be able to make it. We were working on a project called Maths Inside, and to create interesting things for high school students to do in maths classrooms, we started with scientists. Now, science is very creative in that sense where you were saying earlier about coming up with something that didn't exist before or that you hadn't thought of before. But it's also creative in the applications of science and in technology. And may I borrow that laser pointer, Mel? Yes. Thank you. And I'll be very careful only to touch the top button. Okay, so this is, standard laser pointer. I can shoot a beam at the roof and the beam would, there'd be a red light. So a particular robotic scientist called Robert Zlot, and there's Robert there, he had this idea that, yes, we know how to use a laser pointer to shine a laser beam to something. What if we captured it when it bounced back? Then using our knowledge of the speed of light, we could work out how far it was from the pointer to the object that you're pointing at. And then he thought, what if we did that not just for one beam of light, but we put it in a gadget that spun around and shot out lasers in many directions? And then he thought, well, what if we sprayed that all around as we walked through an environment? Then he got the creativity idea of putting the whole thing on a spring. So you can see Robert there with this device on a spring, and the spring flops backwards and forwards, and the device sends out signals in all directions. And when the signals come back and are detected, then there's some clever software which turns it into a point cloud, which represents the interior surfaces of whatever you're walking through. Now, it could be a crime scene, it could be a cave, it could be something like that needs to be measured and described. So I think that's creative, to come up with that idea through various steps and making something technological out of it.
Just to jump in, it's called Zebedee.
It's called Zebedee.
Zebedee.
Because
Check it out.
Zebedee,
It's pretty
yes.
pretty wild.
Zebedee is the name of a cartoon character that jumped on a spring. Yes.
Sorry, George. I'm going to jump in only because.
No, please. open it up. There's
I'm
lots of
not.
things
I'm
here.
not the.
Yeah.
I'm looking. I don't know. I think we might be the least qualified people to answer this question. We're going to try anyway, George, because it hasn't been answered yet. Pure maths, right? So applied maths is maths applied to solve a problem that we encounter in the real world, and we're sailing, or we're trying to write a song, or we're trying to map an environment. And pure maths, as I understand it, is that mathematics which we conceive of, we quite literally create, not to solve any problem, but just because it's interesting, it's just a sheer act of, I'm curious about this. And G.H. Hardy, who we quoted before, he was famous for talking about how much he loved studying prime numbers because of how little application they had, which is just kind of funny because then, humanity had the last laugh because we designed this thing called the internet, and all of its public key encryption and cryptography is all based on prime numbers. So sometimes things start off pure, but they don't last there for very long. We find uses for them, so yeah.
I love that sense of pure maths is actually possibly the most creative of maths, which is just something for no purpose, that with no defined answer necessarily, where you're just putting things together and immersed in that space of numbers and equations, really, if I can bring it down to that simplicity.
Yes, and asking what-if questions.
The what if, yeah. Which, interesting enough, is actually what a creative person will ask. You know, what if I put this colour next to this colour? What if I put this note next to this note, etc., and how that works, and then the calculation. So, will you calculate whether it's worked or not? There's this sense of, and that's where the aesthetics and all that come into it. I'd just like it up to sort of just a bit more, diving in a bit more about how maths, these relationships and that. And maybe we come back to you, Shannon, because let's go back to the circle of fifths and remind us, it is a formula, right? I'm just wondering if you can just elaborate on, well, basically all these formulas which is underpin.
Well, yes, we talked about the circle of fifths and that being a formula or to decipher the mechanics and the structure of music. And that's, if you go back history again, I suppose, Renaissance, Baroque, classical, Romantic period, there are forms, there is structure, there are rules. But when we hit 20th century, we've got a guy called Arnold Schoenberg, Austrian-American composer, known for developing probably one of the most influential versions of the dodecaphonic method of orchestration. So we had major, we had minor, we had memorable melodies, we had beautiful orchestral compositions that we could hum to. But now, he said, why on earth does music need to give us a memorable melody? Why do we need to stick to the circle of fifths? Why do we need to stick to major and minor? So he came up with this 12-tone system, the 12-tone serialism, which of course led itself to atonal music, music with no tonality at all. And the 12-tone system uses all the 12 notes in the chromatic Western scale that we talked about before, but putting them in an order. So this is sort of like a matrix that he used. So let's say the top one here is using all 12 notes that we know in the Western scale. And as you mentioned before, what if? What if we invert that tone row? Then we put it in retrograde. Then we retrograde inversion. So the same tone row can be used multiple times. And I suppose that leads itself to what we call atonal music. Now, I must admit, most of the songs out there in atonal or serialism doesn't really have a memorable melody. It can be quite scary depending on what you're listening to. But this is evidence that composers and writers out there were using maths and numbers to create something that was breaking the rules. And I suppose it was one of the most audacious developments in 20th century music.
What about the devil's chord?
The devil's interval.
Yeah, that one.
Okay, so this is what we call the tritone. So we've got C, D, E, F, so there's your perfect fourth, G, and then you've got the interval it's a sharp 4 or the flat 5. So you've probably heard it in The Simpsons, the C, da, da. So, the interval was never used romantic, it was a cluster, terrible sort of interval. But then, of course, Black Sabbath came out and Ozzy Osbourne came out with the perfect Devil's Interval in their main song, and everyone loved it. So that was it. The Devil's Interval. We don't use it anymore.
Shannon, I just wonder, I was just reflecting on you talking about rules and breaking rules, and it seems like a common thread of what we classify as creativity is when there's something and it's well established, and then we decide, what if we just not do that thing? Like, say that you can take the square root of a negative number. You're not supposed to do that, but what if you could?
Exactly.
And that's just where, creativity sort of flourishes, right?
That's right, and that's what's fascinating about this. It is a mathematical sort of equation, or there are rules that you can use, but it's that what if. We don't have to put it in that way. We can turn it upside down. We can use it. We can use all the different 12 tones and keys in the one song. Who cares? Let's break the rules. Let's make it happen. Won't sound good, but you can do it.
I think this balance between structure and freedom is a really important one in creativity. And often when I'm working with teachers who feel uncomfortable about the notion of creativity in the maths classroom, we talk about, well, what are some structures you can have in place, and then have a little bit of room to move within that. And so it gives some wiggle room to then think about those what-if questions and to look beyond the just algorithmic ways of approaching mathematics in this case. And for students, I mean, what we often see in schools is students come in very creative in the early years. As they get used to how mathematics works, they become less and less creative as the years go on. But there are ways to reshape young children's thinking by using and playing around with these notions of structure and freedom.
Actually, I was going to ask you in a moment. But let's just jump in now. So, I mean, you talk a lot about curiosity. You're encouraging curiosity. So, how do you go about teaching your students? I know I've just jumped the slides around there. I'm sorry, I'm moving it around, but because you were speaking. So let's just talk about curiosity. How do you encourage? When you're teaching students and teaching teachers, can you actually give us some examples of that?
Yeah.
And then I'll come over to you, Eddie, in a moment. Yep.
There's a wonderful educator who's now passed away from the United States called Robert Kaplan, and he described a great problem as an accessible mystery. I always have this in the back of my head, and I think it's the perfect framing, that we want the mathematics for all learners, no matter what they're coming into the classroom with, to be accessible, and we also want it to be some sort of mystery that they are curious enough about to start digging into. And when you have those two ingredients in place, then you're really setting the scene for creativity to evolve and the learner to take the reins and feel like they want to start pushing the mathematics forward and doing the exploring themselves rather than having it handed to them.
I need to jump in before we go to Eddie again. This is an example of that. This my next prop. This is an example of a whole class. Each one of these little items is representative of a student's understanding of mazes and labyrinths. It's a 10-level labyrinth that we then made into this structure and put it all together, and I love it. And it's a what if, yeah, but it's also the mystery. There's so many different ways you can go. There's so many different combinations, and you know when you look through them, there's no one that's the same. But we started off by watching Inception, the movie.
Great, yeah, because it'd be great to hear some of these really practical type of where you've actually applied it in there and gone, actually, here's an exercise that we did when we can really see it. So Eddie, you're into. Oh, have you got an example? No, you're handing it over. Yeah.
I'll get to it later.
Yep. So you like to make it. I mean, you're famous for making maths fun, right? Is that right? Is that a great way to summarise it?
I don't know if I am. Sometimes
I don't know.
Sometimes I'll go visit a school and kids will say like, "Are you famous?" And I'm like, I can't answer that because if I am, you don't need to ask me. And if I'm not, then why? Anyway, I don't know how to answer.
I think
your
you're
question,
quoting
George.
Inception there.
Something like that.
That either you are or you aren't. But it doesn't matter.
Out.
You're in it. You're in your own sort of multiple things going on at the same time. So what practical things can you do to make it fun? I mean, how do we do this? Because we're talking about curiosity, putting them on a pathway. I mean, I think we're talking all levels here, even higher education. Have them curious. It's a bit of a mystery, but curious and mysteries too, but you've got to give them the motivation to go down and go, I want to solve this mystery. So what have you got?
So George, when I knew Melissa was going to be bringing props, I got prop envy. So I brought my own prop with me, and you know, here's a big one just in case you can see. But I brought this one because I'm hoping some people will hang around with me afterwards to see what we can do with this.
Now that's an offer, isn't it?
That's the offer here on the stage. But I love bringing a deck of cards everywhere with me because many years ago I was teaching a class of Year 10 students who were just the most mathematically disenfranchised young men and women who I'd ever met. And one of them, he just point blank said to me, "Look, sir, I'm with you, okay? You're not going to ask me and expect me to do any work, and I'm not going to set fire to anything in your classroom. Can we just agree upon this, right?" And I was like, That's probably a good deal. I'll take it, right? And I just thought to myself, over the course of the 12 months I had with them, what could I do to engage them and interest them in mathematics? And I learned from a fantastic mathematics educator named Matt Parker, who now lives in the UK. I claim he's an Australian because he's from Perth, but anyway.
Perth is in Australia.
Yeah, I know, but
we can claim Perth as Australia.
I don't think he would call himself... Anyway, that's okay. He taught me a card trick that's 100% mathematics. No sleight of hand, no special deck or things like that required. And for me, there's something of intrinsic value. You know, you said accessible mystery before, right? When you see a card trick happen, or when you see anything that looks like magic, right? It's a mystery. You want to know, how did that occur? And for me, what's delightful is, if it's a mathematical card trick, it is an accessible mystery, because the joy of it is working out why it works. And often the best part is actually when, you know, students who I'm working with do the trick themselves. So they know they've done nothing special, but the mathematics has been the engine that's provided the impetus. So for me, I was going to say for young people, but I think older people are the same in enjoying the fun that comes from that kind of mathematics.
Great. The card trick.
That's the only thing I remember about my grandfather. I mean, he was, you know, whatever he was, but he taught me a card trick, which I still know to this day, the only card trick that I know.
I was talking to Mary before about where my own love of maths came from, and it was from my grandmother, my nonna, through cards again. And I mentioned this because I think there's a lot to be said for playing with maths in the form of cards and puzzles and board games, those things that might not seem inherently mathematical but have very much a serious mathematical structure to them, and they invite people in. You don't feel scared to have a go, to play the board game, to play the card game, whatever it is, but you start to learn the rules, you start to think strategically and recognise some important mathematical structures from that.
You had a slide there, I think, for there we are. What's this?
Oh,
That's
me
Michaela's,
again.
yeah. So explain this slide.
It's definitely not as fun as Eddie's card trick.
No.
This is a problem that I've run many times with teachers who teach students from kindergarten to year 12. One of my favourite ways of making maths accessible is just say, have a look at this thing, choose a couple of items or have a look and, you know, have a think about what's going on. Okay? So in this problem, you're invited to make some choices. They're fairly arbitrary, and you're not going to be right or wrong if you make those choices. That's not the point. You just get to play around with some shapes. Particularly in the earlier years, teachers often use printouts so students can cut or fold. And suddenly, they're not looking at fractions as these abstract numbers that don't have any real meaning, but fractions as something that does make sense. Shapes that we've encountered since we were born. So looping back to this accessible mystery and building curiosity and creativity, I think one of the most powerful ways that teachers can do that is by representing and re-representing mathematical ideas in different forms. So in this particular problem, some of the core ideas that come through are around properties of fractions and how you add fractions together. In particular, the notion that if you're looking at, say, a quarter, the area of a quarter must be the same in different parts. So I think the square at the top is the same as one of the triangles. It can look different, but the area needs to be the same to give it the same fractional name. It's not intuitive, but when you start to break up those shapes and maybe rearrange the pieces, this is where the what if comes in. You start with one problem and you give space for saying what if, and new branches of maths open up, and you start to see connections that you probably never realised existed before.
Yeah, I love that. Tyler asking what if, you know? Yeah, that, how do we work that out? Or the reverse, which is the Tyler's doing the floor and the mathematician says, what if we actually understood what's going on here? Because quite often the Tyler would have already had it sorted because they're on a deadline and they're getting paid with that. Melissa, by your own words, you're no maths expert, right? what do you do to invigorate people about maths?
Well, that.
That.
Yeah.
Collage. Is that collage?
That's a big load of pictures. Basically, I think what I do is what I would have loved to have been exposed to when I was younger. That's why I love doing that. We apply mathematics, simple things, really simple things, and make stuff like the crazy, the crazy crushed ball. Exactly.
I looked at it and I was like, that looks familiar.
I'm so glad that Eddie picked up the fact that that is crushed, because Little Symphony there is wearing it in the Mardi Gras in March. So, you know, we work with a lot of different people, and I say we because in the top there you've got Annette Mauer, who's my partner in Steam Pop, and we've run so many wonderful programs just for so many different audiences, not just in schools. In fact, more and more frequently it's not in schools, it's for adults, you know, corporates, just community basically, just having a bit of a go at making things from quite basic mathematics. We always introduce the maths. Mary's been to many of the things that we've run, and then we go from there to create an experience. So the reason I did this big mess here for this slide is because the resounding contributing factor are the people. It's the people. And it's about the experience, because in the same way you probably experience with teachers and some students, it's the perseverance, it's the whole I can't do this to oh my God I did that. That's where my thesis lay, but also it's where I get most of my sense of joy, is actually contributing to this collective sense of achievement through struggle, which started with maths. So the hardest thing is getting people to come, because as soon as you mention that there's maths involved, it's like, oh no. So we haven't quite cracked the marketing.
So do you remove
any suggestions would be great.
Do you remove maths from the marketing?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yep.
But we don't want to trick people either. So we call it maths making, or making with mathematics, or if you're in America, math making. I want to alert you to the lady in the middle with the doodly-doo. She's wearing a beautiful hat that's made of combinations of Mobius, strangely shaped Mobius strips, and she's the CEO of the Museum of Mathematics in New York. So she loved doing that, and she wore it. We're at a restaurant. She wore it out.
Wow, yeah.
In New York.
Fantastic. I think in New York you can probably wear anything.
Yeah, she got away with it.
I don't think that's... If it was Alabama, it might have been different. Mary, how do you feel? You're a long-term educator and you're an advocate.
I love this stuff. I think this is great. And you mentioned Mobius strips. That's an object in geometry that mathematicians have studied for a long, long time and still study. Topology is still a growing field. Sometimes people think mathematics is finished. It's all been invented, and that's not the case. You know, there are still discoveries to be had, more what-if questions to ask, and I just think this is great. And I'm being moved on to a really... We are.
It's called a segue.
Oh,
We're segueing over.
Yeah.
Because it was a lovely leap over, I thought.
No, yes, let's go to the next one. Because something we haven't mentioned yet is the creativity in the natural world and how mathematics can be used to describe beautiful shapes in the natural world. And I'm thinking spirals. Now, why spirals? Because they exist all over the place. They exist in the arrangement of seed pods within a sunflower. You know that when a plant grows, the arrangements of the leaves around the stem follow a particular pattern that can be described as spirals. We've got galaxies that are spirals and so on and so on. Okay, so behind me here is another example from Maths Inside, and the astronomer there is talking about, Lisa Harvey-Smith is talking about the arrangement of parabolic dishes in the desert. Why do we need parabolic dishes in the desert? Because if we have enough of them, we can look further away and into the universe and back in time and all of that crazy stuff. But if you arrange the dishes in a rectangular array, you get something called redundancy in the measurements. That means you've got too many measurements that can be reduced to one. So what they found was that by placing the parabolic dishes on the arms of spirals, they got over that problem. So I just think that that's an amazing thing. And they're looking at spiral galaxies now. Go figure.
Wow, that's fantastic. So in a sense, I mean, I love this because it's the deep theoretical knowledge and the formulas and all that versus, and there's application, and then there's creative solutions based on that. So it's actually the three elements coming together. And I mean, is that part of teaching? Should we always be looking at that in maths, trying to bring those three threads together?
Yes, I think so.
You think so?
Yes,
Yep.
definitely.
Always applied across. I'm just going to bring it over to a very famous name, right? I'm going to get you to tell us a bit about Fibonacci, right? Because that's going to lead us into something here quite special, a very special ending. So,
Sure.
Eddie, tell us about Fibonacci.
Okay, well,
And
just
why should we know that name?
really briefly. So Fibonacci, Italian mathematician who was famous for trying to solve a problem about rabbits. Maybe you're familiar with it, and the whole idea that rabbits, well, apparently they breed like rabbits. And so this idea of, well, if you start with one together with another one, and then they can have children, so you have 1 + 1 gives you 2, and then you say, well, now because they're incestuous apparently, you can go 1 + 2 = 3, and then that new generation, 2 + 3 gives you 5, and so this sort of grows in this way. And these numbers come up in all kinds of weird and wonderful places. Mary actually just referenced one of them on the spiral of a sunflower. So the Fibonacci sequence gives rise to all kinds of weird things. So this 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, etc. If we had the time, I'd actually make you all get out your phones and do a calculation with me that actually the golden ratio, 1.618, etc., sort of emerges out of the Fibonacci sequence, but that's not the only place it comes from. But I'm looking at you, George, to see whether we have the time, and you're not nodding or shaking at me.
Probably
Come and get me afterwards, and when I finish the card trick...
We
That's
have
fine.
to have a part 2 of this.
Yeah. There you go. There's the next time on. Anyway, but that's Fibonacci's got all kinds
you
of
can
great
gather
stuff
in
there.
the card trick afterwards and
Sure.
do that.
But
up.
there's-
That'd be
Very
great.
happy to.
Yep.
Just a segue into Fibonacci too. I was just thinking, Sofia Gubidalina, a Russian composer who actually is very spiritual, and she composes using elements of the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio. So yes, there is music still being composed and used based off the Fibonacci sequence.
What just with that? Is that a joyful sound? Is it what sort of sound? I'm just curious. So we talk about, there's atonal, which you sort of went, and then there's the devils. What's the Fibonacci chord? I mean, what does it sound? Give us can you describe it?
Again, it wouldn't be a memorable melody,
Right.
but it would be a different perspective, different to what Schoenberg was using, his formulas. And of course, well, with Sophia, she would go back and she would analyze a lot of Bach's work. And there is a relationship between the Fibonacci sequence and what Bach was doing as well. So she was influenced by that. So Bach, obviously, very memorable, beautiful, the essence of the fugue. We can memorize his works, but there could be elements of Fibonacci in his work as well. So,
And I suppose with that, there's the Western prism of what music should sound like as
Exactly.
well. So, I mean, and we know that's not the only way, though some people
Exactly.
think it is. There's all these other things. It'd be interesting that what if, I wonder,
exactly.
and going across all these other modalities with music. Yeah.
It's very exciting.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I wondered if we'd have time, but because you said Bach, Shannon, I can't ignore it. I don't know how many of you in the audience are familiar with Gödel, Escher, Bach, and how there's this strange intertwining between, so Kurt Gödel, a German mathematician, Moritz Escher, Dutch graphic artist, and Bach, and there's just this strange intermingling between these things. I think creativity is breaking rules, but it's also connections in places you wouldn't expect it.
But now we've got this. So let's just throw this over to Mary, because Fibonacci, there's something very interesting going on at and I'll let you reveal what that number means in the Fibonacci world.
There is one town in Australia with a postcode 2358, and that town is in New South Wales. It's the only town where the postcode are the consecutive digits from the Fibonacci sequence. So what did they do in that town? They decided they would, and the township is called Uralla, they decided they would make a special park. And look at this. And Mel introduced me to these people.
I introduced,
George
yes,
introduced Mel.
I know. A friend of mine introduced Andrew to me, and I said, "Oh, Fibonacci, you're going to have to talk to Mel." And then Mel introduced it to you, and me and Mel had a field day, just Fibonacciing everything that day when we were talking about it.
Look at the creativity there.
Yeah.
And Andrew Parker, the ceramicist, has made these beautiful panels. So you must go and visit it. It's near Armidale, and it's got this fabulous park. Do you want to say some more, Mel?
I don't have a lot more to say except that good on them for pursuing this, because it was really just people that live in the area under the not so much the guidance but the enthusiasm of Andrew Parker, who is a ceramicist, to say, well, what if we made a park that was based on this because of our postcode? And it's one of those crazy things where you just go, yeah, and they were given loads of money to do it.
Yeah, what if you could get money to do this? Yeah. Yeah,
Twice.
That's the creative person going, how do we make money out of this?
Yes.
And I do remember when we first had the conversation, and me and Mel went down a huge vortex of what if we went to the Pantone, which is the sequence of how do you identify a colour, and then we only went with we used the Fibonacci sequence to.
Oh my God, I forgot about that.
You forgot about this.
I forgot about that.
We lost a couple hours of our lives because our creative minds went, what if we actually only did whole colour sequence and patterns
It's
based
really
on
interesting.
shifting the Fibonacci number and
George, are
doing it
you
that way?
saying you spent a couple of hours of your life on a completely fruitless exercise? You're a real mathematician.
I'm a mathematician.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you. You make me proud. And then we both went, I think we better stop because we were right down that hole. Anyway, you forgot about that, didn't you? Yeah. That was brilliant, of course. Yeah. We got no money for that. That's right. That's fine. In a moment, just I want you to thank everyone on our panel who's come here tonight to hopefully just open up the conversation around maths and creativity and ways. Where are we going back to, Melissa? That's a lovely image, isn't it? Yes. So can you just give a big round of applause to Eddie and Michaela and Melissa and Shannon and to Mary for offering their insights into maths education and really giving us some nice examples of where that's actually in action and how we can do that.